On the 4th of August 1757, the cannons of Brigadier General Marquis de Montcalm opened fire on Fort William Henry. This marked the beginning of a brutal siege that saw a massive French army, supported by their Native American allies, face off against a small garrison of British regulars and provincials. The stakes were high. In 1757, while New France and the 13 Colonies found themselves caught in the expanding 7 Years' War, a string of blunders by British commanders William Shirley and Lord Loudoun left the New York frontier dangerously vulnerable. Their failure to maintain effective intelligence networks over the winter of 1756 to 1757 opened the door to a French surprise attack. With most of the British regulars tied up in a campaign against New France's heartland at Louisbourg, Fort William Henry, along with its sister fort, Fort Edward, was all that stood between the British colonies and a potential French breakthrough on the frontier. The siege of Fort William Henry was characterized by a series of vicious raids and ambushes, the largest naval fleet on Lake George up to that point, significant misunderstandings between Native Americans and Europeans, and ultimately a shocking massacre. The siege gained renewed fame through Michael Mann's 1992 epic historical drama The Loss of the Mohicans, inspired by James Fenimore Cooper's 1826 novel and the 1936 film adaptation. This, however, is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Fort William Henry. In August of 1756, a French force of about 2,500 men, supported by around 250 native allies, under the command of a man with the illustrious name of Louis-Joseph de Montcalm Gozon, Marquis de Montcalm de Saint-Véran, Montcalm for short, arrived near Forts Oswego and Ontario at the western end of Lake Ontario. The British garrison under Colonel James Mercer, poorly supplied and plagued by sickness, could only watch as the French began digging siege trenches toward Fort Ontario on the eastern shore of the river, just a few hundred meters east of Fort Oswego. Within a single day, the trenches reached the fort. Before the large cannons could be hauled up, Mercer abandoned Fort Ontario and retreated to Oswego. Montcalm quickly took control of the fort and constructed artillery batteries on the western edge of the height, where they could target Fort Oswego's exposed, largely undefended east side. It took just one more day for the walls of Oswego to crumble. After Mercer was cut in half by a cannonball, Lieutenant Colonel John Littlehays raised the white flag and surrendered both the fort and his men. Montcalm, who was particular about the honorable code of war, at least on this occasion, viewed this surrender as cowardice. In his eyes, Littlehays had given up too early and failed to earn his respect by not putting up a stronger defense. Because of this, Montcalm prevented the British garrison from leaving, as was usual when defenders held out until their walls crumbled. Instead, they were taken prisoner, while the civilians, mainly traders and their families, would be allowed to leave the following day. After entering the fort, the French, Canadians, and native allies began helping themselves to the fort's rum. Seizing the opportunity, some British soldiers tried to escape, but were swiftly cut down by native warriors wielding tomahawks. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Natives scalped the sick in the hospital, looted the trading post, seized personal property, and captured the families of soldiers and traders. For the natives, who earned little aside from occasional gifts, this was their way of ensuring they left the campaign with spoils and trophies. However, their actions stood in stark contrast to European practices regarding prisoners of war. Montcalm was embarrassed by the natives' brutality, or so his writings suggest, and vowed never to rely on native warriors again, a promise he would ultimately be unable to keep. Rather than achieving Montcalm's aims, the events at Fort Oswego produced the opposite result. The native warriors under Montcalm's command dispersed, spreading the word to their communities that immense riches and numerous scalps could be easily obtained by aligning with the French. The loss of Fort Oswego was a major setback for the British in the French and Indian War. Further weakening their hold on the frontier around Lake Ontario, which was now, as historian William Nestor put it, quote, an uncontested French sea. French forces could now threaten Albany from Fort Oswego, and more native warriors than ever joined the French ranks. By August of 1756, it was clear that the 2 years of war had brought predominantly failures and hardships to the British Empire. Historian Fred Anderson attributes this to several factors, including confusion in the chain of command, the French's effective use of native allies against British settlements, and tensions between the British Crown and the American colonies over garrisoning soldiers, funding military expenses, and control of the troops, particularly in terms of command and discipline. Moreover, 1756 marked the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. The French suddenly mobilized their forces, intending to invade England, and in May conquered British-held Minorca in the Mediterranean. This further strained Britain's ability to support its American colonies. The man tasked with bringing this situation in America under control, John Campbell, the 4th Earl of Loudoun, Loudoun for short, arrived in late July 1756. Upon assuming command, he quickly learned of the devastating loss of Oswego and the precarious state of the British war effort on the northern frontier. Determined to shift the momentum, Loudoun devised a new strategy centered on a bold offensive against Quebec City, the heart of New France. He believed piercing the French to the heart would force them to divert their forces from the frontier, relieving pressure on British-held territories. At the same time, he planned to secure the frontier with 2 key forts, Fort Edward on the Hudson River and Fort William Henry on the southern tip of Lake George. To execute his strategy, he assigned his best troops to the Quebec campaign, and only a few regulars to the command of Brigadier General Daniel Webb, who was in charge of defending the New York frontier. According to the historian Fred Anderson, Webb wasn't particularly well suited for the job, with, quote, regrettable tendencies to panic and overreact, end quote. Worse still, as the year had wore on, Loudoun had yet to receive the green light from London for his plans. There had been a change in government. The new Secretary of State, William Pitt, took over in December and faced numerous pressing issues as the 7 Years' War continued to rage in Europe. Capitalizing on this delay, French and native raiding parties began gathering in the dense forests of the New York frontier, rowing south on the lakes, occupying small islands, and marching along the lake's shores, threatening to unravel the fragile British defensive lines on the frontier. The arrival of winter did not cool the heat of the war. In the bitter cold of what is now upstate New York, the French and their native allies continued to scout and probe British defenses along Lake George and the upper Hudson River, searching for weaknesses to exploit. Lacking reliable intelligence on enemy movements, the British dispatched Robert Rogers and his rangers to reconnoiter the lake's shoreline. Rogers' men were among the few non-indigenous forces capable of operating in the inhospitable frontier in winter. They are considered the forerunners of the modern Army Rangers. In this inhospitable climate, Rogers' men were really dependent on the knowledge passed down from father to son. That's how they knew about the land, how to move silently and with pace across the wintry landscape. In case of a modern catastrophe, such knowledge would vanish, along with electricity, since few fathers actually teach their sons survival skills. Here's where the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, comes in. The book, a hand-illustrated compendium of humanity's biggest discoveries and creations, covers pretty much everything from agriculture, medicine, architecture, communication, to sailing, food preservation, shelter, and even tools of war. For example, it teaches the essentials of how to make gunpowder, saltpeter, charcoal, and, well, time. The book doesn't just cover the darker chapters, though. It's also packed with the weird, the wonderful, and the genuinely inspiring. Like pigeon mail, yes, really. The invention of the telegraph and the discovery of penicillin, it's a wild ride. Huge thanks to the folks behind the book for sponsoring this video. It's an amazing read and it looks gorgeous too. You can check it out for yourself. Links down below in the description. On the 21st of January 1757, Rogers' men, equipped with snowshoes to move through the deep snow, spotted several sleds moving down the frozen lake. and attempted an interception. However, they were spotted as they emerged from the forest, allowing most of the sleds to turn back. Rogers only managed to capture 2 prisoners, who revealed that a raiding party was stationed at Fort Carillon, known to the British as Fort Ticonderoga. Realizing he was outnumbered and his men were in severe danger, Rogers immediately retreated. However, it was too late. The fleeing sleds had already alerted the French-Canadian raiding party. Moving swiftly across the ice, the enemy force pursued the Rangers, eventually overtaking them and setting up an ambush in the deep snow of the forest. The harsh winter conditions proved both a curse and a blessing. The Rangers were trapped in difficult terrain, but the weather made the powder wet, which caused many French and Canadian muskets to miss fire, preventing an even greater slaughter. Even so, the battle raged for hours. By the time the sun set, more than half of Rogers' Rangers had been killed. The survivors, battered and bloodied, managed to fight their way back to Fort William Henry under the cover of darkness. Meanwhile, the French swiftly brought the captured British Rangers to Fort Carillon by sled. There, the prisoners confirmed intelligence that French spies had already gathered in London. The British were planning a major offensive against the heart of New France, Quebec City itself, rather than focusing on Lake George and the New York frontier. This news came at the perfect moment for the French because Governor Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Marquis de Vaudreuil, Vaudreuil for short, had been recruiting Native Americans as early as December 1756. This was incredibly easy for him because many eagerly joined after hearing of the plunder taken from Fort Oswego. With Rogers' Rangers decimated and many of his men too badly wounded to return to duty, the British lost their best source of frontier intelligence. Now they had no eyes on Lake George. In mid-March, a force of 1,500 Canadian and French soldiers and native warriors under the command of Vaudreuil's son, François-Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, Rigaud for short, advanced down the frozen waters of Lake George with sleds. Their target was Fort William Henry. Upon arrival, Rigaud's men harassed a small winter garrison for 4 days, firing from concealed positions and keeping the defenders constantly on edge. More than sporadic gunfire, the sheer presence of an enemy force so close to their walls unnerved the British troops. However, the attackers were poorly equipped for a full-scale assault. Armed only with muskets and ladders, they lacked the necessary artillery to breach the fort's thick walls and sturdy defenses. So Rigaud's men turned their attention to everything outside it. They burned buildings, destroyed boats, and ravaged the surrounding area, crippling the garrison's ability to launch scouting missions or offensive campaigns in the coming spring. After 4 days, Rigaud withdrew, but his raids did not stop. The forests around Fort William Henry rustled with native warriors, sneaking ever closer to the fort, drawn by promises of glory and plunder. They raided British outposts, ambushed supply trains, and patrolled the wilderness between Fort Edward and Fort William Henry, making travel and resupply treacherous. As historian Fred Anderson describes, quote, "So effectively did the Indians and Canadian irregulars confine the Rangers to the vicinity of the British forts that General Webb and his senior officers were deprived of virtually all intelligence concerning French preparations for the coming campaigns." With British forces trapped behind their walls and cut off from critical intelligence, the French had secured a decisive advantage as the spring thaw approached. By end of March, Lord Loudoun finally received a response from William Pitt in London. His proposed campaign against Quebec City was approved, but only on the condition that he captured Louisbourg first. Unfortunately, the French had no intention of going along with his plan. Following an unprecedented recruiting campaign, Native American warriors from dozens of tribes flocked to Montreal, some traveling over 1,500 miles, drawn by tales of the British defeat at Oswego and Rigaud's devastating raids. Fueled by a deep hatred for the British, whom they saw as land-hungry invaders, in contrast to the trading French, they rallied behind Montcalm and Vaudreuil, eager to take the war to the enemy. Though Montcalm had vowed after Oswego never to rely on native warriors again, he quickly abandoned that promise. There were simply too many to turn away. By the summer of 1757, Montcalm commanded an army of more than 8,000 French, Canadian, and native men. Soon, he turned his attention to Lake George, sending more and more scouts down the lake to Fort William Henry. Still lacking intelligence, the British replaced the winter garrison at Fort William Henry with just 1,500 men under Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe. By sheer luck, 2 escaped prisoners reported in late July that an 8,000-strong French Native American army was gathering at Fort Carillon. Monroe immediately asked Webb for reinforcements and sent scouts out around the lake. However, none returned, leaving no easy way to confirm whether a French army was actually approaching Fort William Henry. To play it safe, the British wanted to launch a scouting mission up the lake by boat. They rebuilt their fleet to the best of their ability, but it took until the middle of July to make enough boats. On the 23rd of July, Colonel John Parker finally moved north to Sabbath Day Point with 22 small boats. Parker dispatched 2 boats to scout for a suitable landing site. As his main force of 20 boats neared the shore, they recognized their advance guard and assumed all was well. Unbeknownst to them, the vanguard had been slaughtered, and the figures waving invitingly from the shore were French decoys, luring them into a deadly trap. On the shoreline, French soldiers and their native allies lay in wait, concealed among the trees. As Parker's force drew closer, a sudden barrage of musket fire erupted from the shore, cutting through their ranks. Simultaneously, canoes filled with warriors surged around the point, encircling Parker's men before they could react. The ambush was swift and brutal. Warriors leaped from their canoes into the water, sinking nearly every boat. Only 4 managed to escape. Defenseless, the British swam for their lives, with many dragged under, speared, or drowned in the chaos. The battered and wounded survivors of Parker's force staggered back to Fort William Henry, arriving just as General Daniel Webb was visiting for the first time. Shaken and horrified, they recounted the ambush in harrowing detail, making it painfully clear to the British just how extensive and entrenched the French and native presence on the frontier had become. Realizing the looming threat, Webb and Monroe took immediate action. They ordered all British regulars into the fort, while sending the provincials to occupy Titcomb Mount, a strategic rise roughly 700 meters from the fort. There, they constructed a fortified camp, determined to deny the French the high ground, and not to repeat the mistake that had cost the British dearly during the siege of Fort Oswego the previous year. Despite the worsening situation, Webb did not stay. Fearing Fort Edward, his primary command, would be left vulnerable if he reinforced Fort William Henry too heavily, he departed for Fort Edward. In the end, he only sent 200 British regulars and 800 provincials to bolster the garrison of Fort William Henry. On the evening of the 2nd of August, just as these reinforcements arrived, massive fires erupted along the western shore of Lake George, roughly 11 kilometers from the fort. Alarmed, the garrison dispatched 2 scouting boats to investigate. They never returned. At dawn, the defenders of Fort William Henry could see the vague shapes of a massive fleet on the lake's dark surface. 250 bateaux and at least 150 native war canoes were slowly making their way down the lake. When they came closer, the defenders realized that 60 bateaux were joined into a massive raft carrying heavy French artillery, while a large advance party under François Gaston, the Chevalier de Lévis for short, Montcalm's second-in-command, moved along the shore to take position in the woods behind Fort William Henry toward Fort Edward. Then they began spreading out and sniping at the defenders from the main garrison garden. Shortly thereafter, Montcalm landed and sent a messenger to Monroe, asking him to surrender the fort because, quote, humanity obliged him to warn that it would not be in his power to restrain the cruelties of a mob of Indians of so many different nations. To drive the message home, native warriors stood in a large semicircle near the fort, shouting wildly and yelling to the French to, quote, "Take care to defend yourself, for if I capture you, I will give you no quarter." Nevertheless, Monroe politely refused. Though Fort William Henry was in serious danger, all was not lost. The fort was well armed, boasting 18 heavy cannons, 13 light swivel guns, perfect for raking the walls and the glacis with grapeshot, as well as 2 mortars and a howitzer. Beyond the fort, the provincial camp atop Titcomb Mount was also well fortified. A sturdy stone and log breastwork enclosed the position, which was defended by 6 brass field pieces, 4 swivels, and the small arms of the provincials. While vastly outnumbered, the defenders had the firepower to make any French assault costly, but inflicting heavy losses was all the defenders could hope for. They knew all too well that unless Montcalm made a grave error, their days were numbered. Unless a relief force arrived from Fort Edward within the next 2 or 3 days, the fort's fall was inevitable. For this reason, Monroe sent out couriers to Webb at Fort Edward, warning him of the massive army and that Montcalm had begun to besiege Fort William Henry. On the morning of the 4th of August, Montcalm's engineers began constructing an artillery position less than half a mile from the north bastion of Fort William Henry. Soon, the battery unleashed its thunderous blasts at the fort, shaking the ramparts and sending splinters of wood flying in all directions. At that point, the guns could only target the upper part of the fort's walls, as the glacis, a small earthen rise on the outside of the ditch, prevented the attackers' cannons from aiming at the lower sections. To overcome this challenge, Montcalm quickly ordered his men to dig approach trenches, providing cover as they advanced toward the wall. These trenches would allow them to move their cannons closer and eventually establish breaching batteries, enabling them to target the lower part of the wall and weaken the fortifications from a much closer range. As the artillery duel continued, the Native American warriors in the French ranks were awestruck by the destructive force of the artillery. They occasionally asked if they could take turns firing the guns, and some French soldiers, eager to foster goodwill, agreed to let them try. Meanwhile, the British defenders returned the barrage with their own heavy artillery. They fired so frequently that their cannons began to show signs of strain, and the risk of burst barrels became a serious concern. To prevent this, the British had to periodically cool them down between firings. While the battle raged on, with both sides exchanging relentless volleys in a brutal test of endurance and firepower, on the opposite side of the fort, Levis had positioned his forces in front of Titcomb Mount. His Canadian and Native American scouts made it nearly impossible for the provincials to venture out of their entrenched camp. In the dense woods, native war parties relentlessly stalked and ambushed any couriers attempting to reach Fort Edward, effectively severing all communication with General Webb. Despite the heavy artillery fire from Fort William Henry, Montcalm's forces quickly completed the first siege parallel. Near this newly established line, they set up an additional battery, which opened fire on the 6th of August. The French then docked closer and closer to the fort. By the morning of the 7th of August, they had brought another battery into position and pushed an approach trench within 270 meters of the fort's western wall, eliminating the distance to their target with unsettling speed. Later on the 7th of August, Montcalm sent one of his men to Monroe under a truce flag. The man carried a blood-stained letter from one of Webb's couriers, who had been intercepted by Montcalm's native scouts while attempting to sneak through to Fort William Henry. The letter by Webb's aide-de-camp explained that, quote, "General Webb does not think it prudent, as you know his strength at this place, to attempt a junction or to assist you," end quote, and suggested that Monroe, quote, "might make the best terms of capitulation possible." Along with Webb's letter, Montcalm sent a brief note politely urging Monroe to heed Webb's advice and surrender, emphasizing the garrison's dire situation. But Monroe was determined not to repeat Little Hales's mistake at Oswego. He knew it was still too early to surrender. The fort's walls were still standing, after all. However, the French had answered Monroe's refusal to capitulate by unleashing a constant barrage of shrapnel on the fort with their howitzers. His men did their best to respond in kind, but the British guns, pushed to their limits from continuous firing, were regularly bursting, wounding their crews in the process. By the 8th of August, the morale of the defenders was all but shattered. For the past 4 days, they had been deprived of sleep, caught between the relentless bombardment, the need to return fire, and the constant task of repairing defenses. By late afternoon, Monroe ordered his engineers to assess the damage. Their report was grim. The top 3 feet of the bastions, most exposed to the French fire, had been completely destroyed. The casemates within those bastions had suffered severe damage. All but 5 of the fort's cannons were now inoperable, and the fort's ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. News from the entrenched camp was equally bleak. The provincials had endured even heavier losses from the French indirect fire than the garrison inside the fort. The same night, the French completed their next battery within 250 meters of the fort's western wall. With the situation growing increasingly dire, Monroe knew it was time to send a flag of truce to Montcalm and seek the best possible terms for surrender. At 1 p.m. on the 9th of August, the defenders raised a white flag, signaling the beginning of negotiations. Montcalm and Monroe that the entire garrison of Fort William Henry would be granted safe passage to Fort Edward under French escort. As a mark of respect for their valor, the British soldiers would be allowed to retain their personal items, small arms, unit colours, and a symbolic cannon, but no ammunition. However, this arrangement didn't satisfy Montcalm's native allies. The promises of trophies and glory that had convinced many of them to join the French had gone largely unfulfilled. They had received few scalps, no captives, and little loot such as muskets, powder, and other supplies essential to their way of life. For the native warriors, the war was not about loyalty to king and country, it was about proving their prowess in battle and obtaining spoils they couldn't procure on their own. Now they found themselves with almost nothing to show for their efforts, and a deep resentment for the risks they had taken. Montcalm tried to explain the situation to the war chiefs right before signing the terms of surrender, and had them promise to restrain their warriors. He may have known that some native warriors would not honor his request to allow the British to leave the fort unharmed. However, this is a subject to debate among historians, with opinions ranging from Montcalm deliberately ignoring this possibility, as portrayed in the widely influential film The Last of the Mohicans, to genuinely believing he could protect and escort the British. In any case, the native warriors, deeply resentful and outnumbering the French by quite a margin, had little to no incentive to obey Montcalm's demands. The violence began late in the afternoon on the 9th of August. As the British garrison evacuated Fort William Henry and moved toward the entrenched camp, where they were to wait for the escorted passage to Fort Edward, native warriors stormed into the fort. Immediately, they began looting, scalping, and beating the sick and wounded left behind, as documented in the grim archaeological record of the fort's hospital. Tragically, this act may have been even more devastating to the native warriors than for their victims, as they were likely exposed to smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis, diseases that in the following years would claim more indigenous lives than any military engagement in the war. Although French soldiers and missionaries attempted to intervene, the fury of the frustrated warriors, denied the spoils of war they had expected, proved difficult to control. Throughout the afternoon and well into the evening, they harassed the British troops in the entrenched camp, looting their possessions and terrorizing the exhausted soldiers. It was only by 9 o'clock that night that the French finally managed to clear them from the camp, but the danger was far from over. The warriors lingered ominously just beyond the perimeter, making no secret of their intentions. Exhausted, sleepless, and gripped by fear, the British regulars, provincials, and camp followers assembled in the morning, dreading what lay ahead. The regulars led the column, but as soon as they formed ranks outside the camp, hundreds of native warriors armed with muskets, knives, and tomahawks swarmed around them, unleashing terrifying war cries and demanding their weapons, equipment, and clothing. Meanwhile, other warriors forced their way into the camp, where the provincial troops and camp followers anxiously awaited the march to Fort Edward. Surrounded with no ammunition and packed together tightly, they could do little as the native warriors began looting their possessions, and worse. Women, children, and African Americans were seized and carried off, vanishing into the chaos and confusion. As the column began its march, French soldiers flanked the British regulars at the front and kept the worst violence at bay. The French and Montcalm personally really did try to prevent further violence, often risking their lives in doing so. But despite these efforts, the provincials and camp followers farther to the back were largely to fend for themselves and quickly surrounded. Native warriors moved along the column's flank, harassing, looting, and seizing captives, before disappearing into the woods. The wounded who couldn't defend themselves were either scalped or dragged away, while others were stripped of their clothing and belongings. Panic spread like wildfire. Some huddled together for safety, while others fled in all directions, into the woods, the French camp, the entrenched camp, or forward to Fort Edward. All discipline collapsed. A sudden war whoop echoed through the forest, and within moments, dozens of warriors surged forward, tomahawking the most vulnerable, primarily those at the rear of the column. The killing lasted only minutes, and then, as quickly as they had emerged, the warriors withdrew into the trees, carrying with them scalps, captives, and plunder. Most natives left the French army immediately after this, or over the next days. Once order was restored, the British had lost 185 soldiers and camp followers, and a much larger number, probably around 500, had been taken captive. Another 300 to 500 provincials and regulars had found refuge with the French. With most of Montcalm's native allies gone, his provisions running low, most of his cannonballs spent on Fort William Henry, and the campaign season slowly coming to an end, he didn't want or simply couldn't afford to push further to Fort Edward, and eventually retreated to Fort Carillon. So, in the end, Monroe's brave defense of Fort William Henry and the terrifying massacre that followed ultimately yielded results for the British, albeit unintentionally. The French campaign came to a halt because resources were exhausted and their native allies abandoned the campaign. However, Monroe didn't get the chance to enjoy this small victory. He died the same year from apoplexy, which some historians attribute to his anger with Webb. Indeed, the ill-suited Brigadier General was recalled because of his actions. Loudoun too was relieved of duty because he failed to capture Louisbourg and returned to New York empty-handed. The war year of 1757 had been an utter and complete failure for the British Empire. We hope this brought the epic story of this siege to life in a way you enjoyed. For further reading, we highly recommend The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, and the other 4 books in his Leatherstocking Tales series, which follows the famous characters Nathaniel Bumpoo and Chingachgook. These classics are essential reads for anyone interested in this period. You can find them, along with many other book recommendations, on our Amazon page, linked in the description box below this video.